Jai Hind, and a very warm welcome to our ladies and gentlemen on the Center for Joint Warfare Studies. Today afternoon on a Saturday. Saturday is a good day to have a webinar because especially a webinar like this where we have serving officers also joining in so they can join from home. And thank you very much. Today we'll look at Mr. Ananth Krishnan, who's here. Thank you very much for spending your time. He is the author of the book India's China Challenge. And China's challenge is what has been keeping us very busy in the last lockdown period of last 5-6 months since May early. It's been a year of disruption. 2020, we've had a disruption in COVID-19, a disruption of the century. We had a disruption by China, but aggressive behavior along the line of actual control. We have a disruption in the way we are living. The individual behaviors have changed, behavior of society has changed, behavior of people has changed, the behavior of nations have changed. So this has been a year which is of difference. Normally it says only 20 का but the 2019, 2020 are totally different years altogether. And that is how we are here today. We looking at China. China is to say that China is important to India. The statement. The only thing is that we look at China. I've been studying China, but I don't understand China. I try to study China. I don't understand China. I'm being very frank about it. Especially if you men military, China has been a mystery. We deal with the PLA. We meet the PLA in interactions. We meet them in the border person meetings. We meet them in joint exercises. We meet them in various meetings somewhere else. But we don't really understand China. Most of the China we know is from a Western perspective. From the perspective of the US think tanks, from the perspective of the West, we read that and that is the opinion form we have. But today, we have Mr. Ananth Krishnan, who has been a decade in China, writing on China and writing on China as he understands China. I think there's no better expert in India who has stayed there a decade and who has known China, who has met the Chinese people, who understands Chinese language, who understands the people of China, who understands what they do and why they do. So that is, I think, a change this time, and that is what we are looking at, especially in the armed forces. We've been in that no war, no peace scenario, but I don't call it no war, no peace anymore. I call it near war, no peace. So thank you very much for this. We would like to understand, after we understand China, we would like to understand China's aggressive behavior, not only along the LAC with India, but also in the South China Sea, in the East Sea. And we don't call it East China Sea, we call it East Sea. In Vietnam, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines. So you name it, so there has been a change out there. I will not take much time, but let me just hand over to General Banerjee. But before I do that, let me say that it is a must to read this book, India's China Challenge. It's a very interesting book. It talks about a journey through China rise, and what it means for India. So that is the key issue of the book. And we don't read it. I think we need to study it. I've read it. I need to study it further to understand China. So I welcome Mr. Ananth Krishnan, and I also welcome Mr. General Banerjee, who is be conversing. Me and General Banerjee converse on conversation with Mr. Ananth Krishnan today. General Banerjee needs no introduction. He is well known in the strategic circles. I think everyone out there knows him very well. He's a China expert in totality. He has been to China about 40 times in his career, which I think is a lot of it. And he has been dealing with China. He was one of the first two officers to go to China in 1991 when China opened up. He's been the deputy director of the IDSA. He's also been the executive director of the South Asia Society on Strategic Studies Institute, RCSS, based in Colombo. He's been director Institute of the Peace and Conflict Studies, a leading think tank which he co-founded. He has served all along the northern borders. He was a BM of the brigade when the last shot in anger was fired on 25th October 1975 at Kalungla. He was there that time. He also consulted to the UN. He was one of the first to visit China, like I said earlier, and he's one of the most respected and regarded military experts on China and military leader. So without much ado, I will hand over to Jen Banerjee for introductory remarks and to carry on the conversation from here onwards. Over to Jen Banerjee. Carry on.
Okay. Now, what a wonderful occasion to meet together, and I see a very large audience already present. I'm sure more will join. Here, among went to China first in the summer of 2008, and then to Beijing from 2009, and he has been there till August 2018. This period coincided with China's dramatic rise in the international arena. This was a miracle 3 decades, phenomenal economic rise. And at that time, initially, it was also a very open society, not perhaps quite like what it is today. And Ananth was a special correspondent with the Hindu, with the India Today. And, during my earlier years, whenever I was to visit Beijing in this period, I used to seek out Ananth Krishnan and have an evening with him during the beginning of my visit. And then he would fill me up with the details of what is actually happening in China and on China-India relations. And this is what, over the years, his observations, he has now put together in the form of a book. Now, that he spent now in China also coincided with the Deng's 24-character exhortation to the people that to hide one's capability and bide one's time. And so this was a period that China was really trying to open up. And there are a few characteristics of this period that is relevant for our study. Firstly, China opened up, I think, prematurely, countering Deng's advice. And this was because, firstly, in 2008, the economy collapsed suddenly due to the terrible developments in the banking situation in China. And then 1990, also a book by a very famous book that came out at that time. It was reflecting Paul Kennedy's book on the situation in the world and the global phenomenon, and it popularized this thing of imperial overstretch by the United States. 3 clear developments that took place in China, which gave the Chinese leadership an enormous amount of confidence to break out into the world somewhat prematurely. First was the Olympics conducted in 2008. For the first time, the Olympics was conducted in a superb manner, and China was the maximum number of gold medalists in that. 2009, 1st of October, at anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, they held a massive parade, military parade in Beijing. And in this military parade, they demonstrated the DF-24 missile for the first time. And this was the carrier killer, which would now that US aircraft approaching China's shores would be extremely careful. And then after that, in 2010, the Shanghai World Fair. And I had the privilege of attending there, spent 2 days in the fairground. That was a coming out party for the Chinese industry. And so because of these 3 developments and a comparative weakness that China perceived in the USA, that China really opened up. And I think it gave up the Deng's to keep its head low prematurely. Now, at this time, this was a period spent in China. And he traveled all over and almost all the provinces of China, including in Tibet a few times, and met several very interesting persons. And their insights and the way he narrates them is what constitute the bulk of this book. Very well constructed, going into all different as it emerged, and so hence we have a clear and a broad perspective of Chinese developments. Now, the book itself, India's China Challenge, a journey through China's rise and what it means. It is true that a more powerful China, as it emerges, will be a serious challenge to India and is of major concern to India. But let me also add here that it is also a challenge to China. Of all countries, India is perhaps poised to put up a serious challenge to China in the future. And in that context, it is also a bit of India's simultaneous rise. Now, this book, of course, diversity and the complexity of the developments in China. And as in India, if you are as an Indian, if you are reading only one book on China for the next 10 years, I would suggest you read this book. Today's discussion will primarily focus on understanding China through Ananth's eyes. And initially, it will be a conversation between Vinod, myself, and Ananth. We'll raise the issues, and I will request both Vinod also to respond primarily on the strategic dimensions of our relationship. On that, there's nobody other than General Bhatia, who has been the Director General Military Operations, subsequently dealt with China on important military issues regarding the border confidence building measures and laying down the rules of engagement, etc., who is poised to respond to issues of strategic questions, and I'll request him to do that as he feels fit. But let me also say that our discussion today is not about the current military or of the developments along the border. This is broadly on China in the last 10 years and what is China likely to be in the future. Now, let's begin this discussion. My first question, of course, is, may I suggest that India is poised in a very difficult situation. To our west, we have Pakistan, which has a military that has a country. And whenever the military is not directly ruling over the country through martial law, it puts up a civilian leader like it is currently, and therefore the Pakistan army is in the background. And have a country which has a political party that has a country. Now, it is the Chinese Communist Party, which was established in 19, which really has a country, and the country is ruled by the General Secretary of the party, which is Xi Jinping. And the party has been in existence from 1921, 1st of October is its birthday. And since then, it is the Chinese Communist Party. But the Chinese Party, of course, is also today approximately 93 million strong. And hence, about 1 in 16 Chinese Communist Party member. And quite clearly, it is the Communist Party which is ruling China. Let's try and understand and request Ananth to describe as to what is the Chinese Communist Party, what is its relationship with China, how does the Communist Party function, what is its broad structure, how is it organized, and how does it actually exercise its authority over the entire country. Over to Ananth for our discussion.
Thank you so much, General Banerjee, for having me today. Thank you so much, General Bhatia, as well. Really appreciate this opportunity. And to all of you who have joined today. At the outset, I think I should put one major qualifier, which is, as General Banerjee said, I used to enjoy meeting him when he would come to Beijing for conferences and Track 2, and I would actually be interviewing him to try and understand what was happening. So I'm by no means a strategic or military expert. So this book is more a reporter's perspective. So that's one thing I just want to qualify. And I think I'll probably learn more from all of you here today than the other way around. Before I answer the question about the party, what I wanted to do was, before I begin, try and outline what the book is about. The first section of the book actually is about the party, which is the question that General Banerjee asked. So I have structured the book into 6 parts, and I identify what I think are 4 challenges that India faces from China. I think the first challenge is a political challenge, and that is of dealing with a one-party state that is trying to shape, I think, the world's institutions in line with its values more and more. And I think so for us, it's very important to try and understand what those values actually are. And the party, of course, I think is central to all of that. In addition to that, I discussed the economic challenge, both of our bilateral trade and investment relationship, as well as learning from China's growth story. I also addressed the diplomatic and military challenge, and of course, the boundary question. And lastly, the 4th challenge that I describe is what I call the history challenge of dealing with the memory of the war and the unresolved boundary as well. Now, I think the first part of the book, in many ways, is tries to answer the question that General Banerjee posed to me, and that question is, what is the role of the party in all of this? And I tried to write it in a way to respond to how I think many people have portrayed or assumed the China model to be, in part because of how China wants the world to see itself. I think that before the rise of Xi Jinping in 2012, there was, over the last 2 decades, a retreat of the Communist Party. Since the end of the Cultural Revolution and since Deng Xiaoping's time, there was a retreat of the Communist Party, I think, in many ways, from the ordinary lives of people in China. The party no longer was giving just small examples in terms of the way economic reforms changed everyday life, and the relationship between the party and the people is that you went away from the system where you had your Danwei or work units that gave you permission to have a child, that gave you permission to marry, that decided where you will work and where your children would work. All of that went away, and there was, over the last 20, 30 years, you had this huge retreat of the party. And I think that the Chinese leadership, in many ways, wanted the world to see China as not being ideological, even though they are a communist party. They wanted the world to see China that is an economic superpower, the China of reforms. But I am trying to question that portrayal in this book, where I want to emphasize how the party still remains so central to everything in China. And I think if we can say the 3 Ps, and this is something that goes back to not even Mao Zedong, but even if you look at how Lenin and Stalin saw the role of a political party. And I think China still continues that today, with the Communist Party being 99 years old, which is the party retaining control over the 3 most important Ps, which is personnel, propaganda, and the PLA. And the book, of course, I go into more detail into how all of this works. But I think that in paying attention to how much China has changed over the last 30 years, we sometimes forget to look at what hasn't changed. And I think the nuts and bolts of the party and the way it controls these commanding heights of key institutions, from the courts to the police to the army to the media, that has not changed at all. And I think, General Banerjee, one thing that we should, some ways, we probably should be thankful to Xi Jinping is for the fact that he has shattered this illusion of this post-ideological China where all of these things didn't matter. And I think he's reminded everybody of the centrality of the party, which is why I think you're really seeing a backlash now, especially in the West. And I think more so in India recently, in terms of doing business, for example, with companies in China. So I would start by just saying that, so in that sense, I think that we should be under no illusion about the fact that it's the beating heart of the Chinese system. And I don't know if that at least provides one answer to your question.
Okay. Directly to Communist Party's control over the PLA. Now, under Xi Jinping in particular, we see a assertion, a total control of the party over the PLA. And Xi Jinping has repeatedly said again and again that the loyalty, the response of the PLA must be and to the Communist Party. Now, how does that actually impact on policies? And do you see any weaknesses in this system, this party's control over the PLA?
No, that's a great question, and I think you probably are better placed to answer it than I am in terms of party PLA relations. But I think that one interesting thing that, if looking back over these 10 years in China, I first moved in 2008 during right after the Olympics. And I think 2012, in many ways, was such an inflection point in Xi Jinping taking over in November 2012. What really shocked me when I first came and started reporting a little bit about the PLA was the fact that this is pre Xi Jinping, that I was quite taken aback by how much it was kind of like a fiefdom, like a state within a state, in a way that I never understood coming from a country with a professional military. The fact that obviously, number one, it is a political army, that it is completely it answers to the Communist Party of China, not to the state, which all of us here know. But I think more than that, what really left me dumbfounded was, for example, its commercial businesses, which, of course, I think were beginning to be diluted from Deng Xiaoping's time. But the fact that it owned real estate, the fact that it really worked like a state within a state, and this is most evident in a place like Xinjiang, where you really see, and where I did 3 or 4 trips, and you really see how it is much more than a military in the way that countries imagine a military to be. But one consequence of all of this was the fact that corruption in the military was such a huge issue, I think, around the 2012, 2013 time, at the time of Xi's ascension. And everybody in China that I spoke to knew that the generals in China were lining their pockets, that ranks were being sold, and it was a hugely corrupt military and an institutionalized corruption within the military, which is something that really shocked me when I first moved there. The fact that I think it was open secrets that promotions were tied to financial transactions, and everybody had business interests in the military. So, which is why I think that when Xi in 2015 and 2016 announced those reforms, it was quite striking. And I think a lot of people were skeptical that he would be able to do what he did, because I think both of his two predecessors, Jiang and Hu, were never able to do anything on that scale. And I think the fact that he did it is quite interesting. The way that I think the big 4 departments were cut down to size, that they were all put on a par. And I think all of them now directly report to the Central Military Commission in a way that wasn't in the past. And I don't think it's only optics. I think that he has pushed through these reforms in a way that many people that I interviewed initially in 2015, 2016 believed was not possible. Obviously, we don't have a great direct look internally into how it functions, but from everything I hear and see and read, it seems that he has been able to assert his control, especially in the way that he removed the 2 generals initially, and the way that he has restructured the military. I think that he has done quite a bit in addressing the corruption issue. But I think the flip side of all of that is, during one visit, we never had great access to the PLA. I should be upfront with you. The PLA never really met with the press that much. And in the book, I do mention that the only time I was ever called to a PLA press conference was during the Doklam crisis. And that obviously was because they wanted to address the Indian media. But I think that people in the PLA will probably tell you that they wish they could spend less time than they currently do in terms of the political aspects of being in the Chinese military, which is reading all the readings that they have to do. And political education is so much a part of what they have to do. So in that sense, I think it's a really unique military. And I think that everything that Xi has done since 2016 has been quite striking. I think he has done what many people thought he would never be able to do. But in terms of their modernization as well, I'll defer to you on this, General Banerjee and General Bhatia. Clearly, they have a very, very long way to go. But I think that, make no mistake, that he has at least made it very clear that he's the guy in charge. And I think that everything that is happening happens at his pleasure, including the events on the boundary. And I think one thing we can lay to rest, thanks to his reforms, is this debate that we used to have, I think, in the early 2000s, when something happened on the border. Was it something done by a local commander, or was it something done by somebody higher up? I think we can put one thing I think we can say with confidence is that those questions we can put to rest.
Yes, thank you. As we are on the PLA, can we perhaps discuss very briefly the role of the political commissars in the PLA organizations, the parallel organization of the military leader and along with him the political commissar? Would you like to just reflect a bit on that, Ananth, and perhaps Vinod as well? You have been in touch with the PLA more often perhaps than Ananth. Yes.
Yeah, the one point that I'd make before handing over to General Bhatia is just stepping back. This is not just a PLA issue, but one thing that I do highlight a lot in the book is this whole idea of political discipline, which is something that Xi has revived since he took over. And one scholar that I speak in the that I quote in the book tells me that ideological discipline and political discipline have been two of the key themes of everything that he has done besides his corruption campaign. And I think the feeling was, as this person put it to me, that at the time that he took over, that there was a lot of, we forget now, but 2012 was really a very tumultuous year. When he took over, there was a split in the party that only later they acknowledged with the whole Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang case. And there was a feeling, I think, among many people there that there was no political discipline. And there was a yearning for somebody to bring everybody in line. But I think it's probably a case that they got more what they bargained for. But I think that it has been quite remarkable that how much this is, if you analyze Xi Jinping's speeches over the last 7, 8 years, political discipline has been such a marked theme of it. I think we can come later to the question of dissent and debate and reaction to Xi. But I think one consequence of this, and everybody that I spoke to in my own day-to-day in China, whether it was university professors or journalists, is that political discipline has become such a suffocating theme in China, and I'm sure, and it appears to the military as well. And it has been, I think, enforcing this has been a really one reason why he's been able to do everything that he's been able to do since he took over in 2012.
Vinod? General Bhatia?
Yes, sir. Yes. I have a very simple take on it. I do think, in my little experience I have the PLA, the military commanders, they defer to the political commissars. They always look towards him for approval, towards him for the right thing or not. And in the border personal meetings also, they are, I think, governed by what the political commissars think, what they do, and what they report back. That's a very simple question. But I would like to, take what Mr. Ananth says a little forward. In that, you spoke about the media, and I find that China is very concerned, very sensitive to Indian media. So Indian media doesn't have very many resident journalists in Beijing. I think there are only 3 or 4 of them. But whenever we spoke to them, they always said, "Why can't we control your media?" No, India cannot control the media. Media, whatever, we are a democratic country. The media has got its freedom. But they were very concerned about the media, and this also reflects how, in the recent letter which the Chinese mission in Delhi, which they forwarded to media, to Indian media, to be responsible and not talk about Taiwan on the national day. So they are very sensitive to Indian media. Why do you feel, or do you feel about Indian media's role in China's perception of things, what happens in India?
That's a great question. I think, first of all, I think the media strategy has really been counterproductive. If you look at what they tried to do with Taiwan, where they tried to tell Indian media houses not to report on the Taiwan National Day on October 10th, which is absurd. And if anything, it just pushed more media to report on Taiwan. I can tell you one. So no problem. So the point that, just a small anecdote that about 2 weeks ago, I interviewed Taiwan's foreign minister for the Hindu. And so we published this interview, and immediately after that, we had a letter from the Chinese embassy, and they even put out a statement, saying that this was terrible and violating the One China principle, which is slightly absurd because of the fact that we are a private media. And the One China principle is something between the governments of India and China. But the reaction to it I found striking, because they have this expectation that an official Indian government commitment to China applies to the Indian press as well. Which is very strict, which is because that's how their press works. And everything in China, obviously, the Chinese press especially after Xi Jinping took over, it's a very party-controlled media, even though I must say that it wasn't always the case. Throughout the 2000s, there were varying levels of control. They allowed some very good media to come up that was semi-independent, but all of that has now stopped. And so I think it's a mirror imaging where they expect that our media will be like their media and do what the government wants us to do. But obviously that's not the case. But it's not a new thing, General Bhatia. I think it's been, I remember when I first moved in 2009 as well. 2009 was another thorny time in the relationship. I think there were border incidents, plus there was this whole issue of His Holiness Dalai Lama going to Arunachal Pradesh in 2009. And there was another uproar in China, and they were very angry about the Indian media then. And they were asking Indian officials to restrain the Indian press. So I think it's been a recurring theme that I think goes back to the 1960s as well. And I think they have to come to terms with it. Something that the Indian journalists found quite frustrating in Beijing is that they somehow never had these expectations of the Western press. They knew that the big Western media outlets were independent, but somehow they felt that non-Western media was something that they could pressurize in a way that they never attempted to do with the others. But of course, we always resisted that. But one other point about the Indian media that I mentioned in the book, and I'm slightly disappointed in how generally the Indian media covers China by not having correspondents based there. I think it's a big problem. Throughout 2020, when you had the pandemic and this border crisis, there were only 2 Indian reporters based in all of China, one for the Press Trust of India and one for Hindustan Times. So it's a sad state of affairs where I think that you need to have more reporters on the ground to get a sense of what is happening there. And that's a failing on the Indian media's part, though it's not a China-specific problem. I think there generally has been the Indian media no longer sends reporters out onto the field. They're just happy to have this studio system of getting people in to debate issues rather than report. So it's not a China problem, it's a broader problem. But as far as China is concerned, I think we really need to have more people there on the ground without question and invest the resources in that.
Yes, that's very true, Ananth. The reality is that our media houses are not really willing to put their money and put a reporter in China. It'll cost a lot of money. Perhaps they feel that it is not economically not sufficient reciprocation is available. And of course, only the Hindu has one. Your predecessor in China, really, Pallavi Iyer, again, was a very noted reporter from there, even before your period. Now, anyway, let's come back to once again to well, actually, the reality is, as I said, 1 in 16 Chinese is a Communist Party member. So therefore, whether in Commissar or anybody else, all the senior officers of the PLA will be actually Communist Party members. And even companies, for example, some company Havildar majors equivalent would also be party member. And so all key assignments, and in the media, all editorial policies, etc., they have party members with each media organization, several of them quite often, who are dictating and controlling the media policy, the editorial content, and all that. Now let's come back to Xi Jinping and his role in China today. It is said that he personally heads 11 top posts in the country. He's also called the chairman of everything. And that, as we know, is not only for a fixed period of 5 years and 10 years perhaps, but he's for life. So what does it really mean in terms of the rulership in China? How does he actually rule? Isn't there an opposition to him among the party members and others, because they know that they will not have a chance to become general secretary or the chairman subsequently? So what is the credibility, effectiveness, and Xi Jinping's control over the party machinery, and how does it actually operate?
So 2 things, Ranji. I think the first thing is to note how he has changed the structure and the party state structure since he took over. I think the biggest change, of course, has been the fact that the system of collective leadership is no longer in place. And I think that a lot of people even in China were uncomfortable by the fact that that has changed, because Chinese scholars themselves felt that this was what allowed them to have 3 successful, peaceful transitions of power. It was what also allowed them to escape the fate of other dictatorships, that it wasn't pinned on one personality. And so I think a lot of people feel there's a lot of risk in what he's doing, even if in 2012, 2013, there were people in the party who, for various reasons, felt that they needed this kind of more centralized, strong leadership because of the stasis of the Hu years. So he was, in some sense, in the book, I do explain in detail how he was in many ways the right guy at the right time to make the most of this yearning for stronger leadership and exploit that. And he mainly did that through his corruption campaign, which also is a reason why people can't speak out within the party, because everybody has skeletons in the closet. So you can't really speak out. And I think the other thing that he really has done is concentrate power by the creation of what are called these leading groups. Is now no longer sort of purely in the hands of the bureaucrats. It's back in these bodies. And many of these leading small groups directly report to Xi on everything from economic policy to reforms, to even the South China Sea, to cyber security. So he's much more in control than his predecessors were, who shared responsibility among the members of the Politburo Standing Committee, which of course was 9 and now it's 7. But even within the 7, of course, it's very clear that it all rests with him right now. In terms of opposition to his rule, it's a great question. I think, frankly, I don't think there is serious opposition to his rule, only because even if people do have grumblings, the costs of speaking out are, frankly, enormous, and a huge prohibitive cost in getting anybody to say anything. If you look at the fact that somebody like Ren Zhiqiang, the real estate tycoon who wrote an essay in April, he was very well connected, the son of a former official, someone very close to the Chinese vice president. For one essay, he got an 18-year jail term. So the prohibitive costs are so high. But one thing that I want to note is that a lot of the dissent that is coming out is the dissent from the liberal intelligentsia in China. It's people like Ren Zhiqiang, it's people like the party school professor Cai Xia, who is now in the United States, and she wrote a lot of stinging criticisms of Xi Jinping. Cai Xia said that in her view, as someone in the party school, she was very familiar with the thinking of party officials. She said she estimates that 60 to 70% of senior people in the party are unhappy with the current political direction. But she was also realistic enough to say that she didn't think they were going to speak out only because he commands the police and the courts and the anti-corruption machinery and everything else. But one thing I would say is I think he is not bothered by these liberal critiques, and he's more concerned actually about criticism from the other flank, which is the nationalist critiques, the criticism that he's not strong enough, that he's not nationalist enough. I think that's the thing that keeps him awake at night. One small anecdote. In April 2019, the Politburo Standing Committee was about to sign off on the Phase 1 trade deal with the US, and the entire text of it was ready. But what happened at the 11th hour was this whole text was prepared by Xi Jinping's right-hand man, Liu He. But he was taken aback that 3 of the 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee vociferously objected to the deal and said that they were selling China's interests. And that prompted Xi to actually ditch what his own advisor had said, because he was being accused of selling away Chinese interests for this trade deal, and he completely backtracked on it. And this has been borne out in the reporting of several journalists. And I think it just goes to show that rather than the liberal critiques that come out, I think he's more concerned about the nationalist critiques, which will, I think, push him to take a harder line as a way to stave off such criticism, which is something that I think we should be mindful of.
Okay. Now, Ananth, let's come back to the China dream. Now, can you explain the Chinese dream to us a bit? As you know, Xi Jinping began this immediately after he took over power as the General Secretary. And since 2012, the whole concept of the Chinese dream has been a central theme of the Chinese policies. Of course, even 2 years earlier, Col. Chin Mingfu of the National Defense University actually wrote out a book spelling out exactly what they felt, or the military felt, about the Chinese dream. And much of what Xi Jinping is trying to implement, of course, comes from that as well. But can you briefly tell us what is the part of this Chinese dream, and are they really in the process of achieving it?
I think it's in some ways it's an amorphous, vaguely defined idea, and I think that it's if you look at some of the Communist Party goals and targets, there's a reason why they are, even going back to Mao's days. There's a reason why they are amorphous and vague, is because often you can't achieve these targets if you put out a very specific goal. So I think the Chinese dream is best thought of as the favorite word right now is rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So that's essentially what the Chinese dream is in its most basic element. And I think that I do look at the history of this idea in the book, and the rejuvenation is not something that national rejuvenation has been something that Chinese leaders and thinkers have been writing about for the past 100 years. In the book, I write how Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, had founded a revived China society at the turn of the last century. And it's been this idea that has captivated Chinese leaders and thinkers and intellectuals for 100 years. I also found it quite interesting that right before Xi came up about this, you mentioned that there was a book called The China Dream a few years before Xi Jinping came up with this. Also, in fact, Xi Jinping's great rival, Bo Xilai, who was purged, obviously, in this power struggle, he had come up with something called the Road to Rejuvenation, as in a way to strengthen his own sort of political goals and careers around the time of 2010, 2011. So it's something that has been going around for quite some time. And I think that, to put it really simply, frankly, it's a nationalistic idea. It is an idea that it is a responsibility of the Communist Party and every Chinese citizen to play a role in achieving this dream of rejuvenating China. Like I said, it's amorphous, so it's useful for the party as this can be tailored to suit specific policy goals as they see fit. Whether it is in getting Chinese private companies or tech companies to do their bidding for the Chinese state, whether in terms of censorship or whether in terms of civil-military fusion. It is useful in terms of getting the Chinese media to behave in line, because if you don't, obviously, you will be seen as not playing a role in national rejuvenation. So it's a very useful theme, I think, and at its essence, it's a turn to nationalism. And I think that I suspect that's one reason why we are seeing this sort of manifested in China's external behavior in the last few years, because of this whole emphasis on a turn to nationalism. And one Chinese thinker, one last point that I didn't mention, one Chinese thinker who's become really influential now, this theorist called Jiang Shigong in Peking University, who I quote in the book, he mentions why they turned to this idea of rejuvenation as a Chinese dream. And that's because the communist ideology itself no longer had any relevance to people in China. The fact that there was nothing ideological tethering the people to the party, that in the last 10, 15, 20 years, they felt that. And for the party to do something to reassert itself in the public sphere, this was possibly the only thing they could turn to, which is why I think they have chosen this and this turn to nationalism.
Now let's move on from the political and military questions to the economic question regarding China. What, according to you, is the secret of China's rapid economic growth? It's often been called as a miracle. The 30-year period during which China expanded its economy several times is quite unique in the history of the world. Now, what do you attribute to this Chinese economic miracle? And sustained with the sanctions and restrictions and technology restrictions in particular over China, can the Chinese economy continue to sustain this rapid economic growth going on to the future?
To answer the second part first, and I'll explain why it can't be sustained, because of the fact that the current model that they've relied on, I think they themselves know. They themselves know it's nearing the end of its shelf life, and they're trying to transform the economy. And unfortunately for them, the global environment has changed from their time of their emergence in the early 1980s and 90s to now, in terms of the global appetite to do business with China has changed. So it's a fundamentally different model, and I think that they need to be more self-reliant, and that's why the current phrase of the moment is what they're calling dual circulation, which is the Xi Jinping's pet idea that they aren't no longer reliant on the world, but internally self-reliant. And that's an acknowledgement of the fact that the world is no longer as welcoming of their economic rise as it was. So I think it can't be sustained. But in terms of what they got right, which is something I try and answer in the second part of the book by traveling to Guangdong province and Zhejiang province and speaking to factory owners and others there, I think one of the interesting things is that I think a lot of people focus on the 2000s, which is the China of the SEZs and the infrastructure and the skyscrapers. But a lot of what underpinned all of that actually was things that happened in rural China. So actually the success story began in the countryside and not in the coastal areas. It began in the countryside thanks to the reforms that they put in place, the emergence of these township village enterprises, with the fact that they had invested in rural healthcare and in education. And all of that came to fruit 10 years later. So I think that without this rural success story, the rest would not have happened is one very interesting takeaway, which I think often gets lost. It's not that they just threw money at SEZs and infrastructure and there was a boom. They needed to have the workforce to make the most of that boom. And I think that's one thing. The investments in social capital is one really key factor. I think the second thing that made this story unique, and I argue in the book why it can't be replicated, is because of the fact that they had the advantage of both location and timing. Location in the sense that they had Hong Kong and the other East Asian economies, which really gave them both investment and models to follow. And timing in the sense that the world at that point was, it was the right moment for them in this era of globalization. The fact that they were able to enter the WTO, and that really gave them the base to take off. But obviously now the whole world has changed. If any country was trying to replicate an export-driven strategy, it's going to be so difficult because who's going to want to buy your goods at a time when countries are all turning inward? So I think they were really fortunate that there was this confluence of so many different factors, both internally and externally, that allowed for them to do it. So in the book, I make the case that even if it can't be replicated, I think there are some lessons to draw, which is don't forget social capital when you're only looking at hard capital.
Thank you, Ananth. I think that's a very fine answer. Now, can we come quickly to the China-India relations? Now, what would you describe as China's approach to India? For example, how does an average, ordinary Chinese view India? As a friend or an enemy?
Now, that's a great question. And I would say that in short, the answer would be, it depends who you ask. And I think that just to give you a small example, even in the current climate, I think if you ask somebody in the military or security sectors of China, frankly, there's no doubt, I think they look at India as an adversary. And that's borne out by the actions along the boundary. I think there's make no bones about that. If you look at some of the people that I interviewed who work in the Chinese tech sector, who are investing billions of dollars and acquiring stakes in Indian companies and in cultivating India as a market, they look at India as an opportunity. And I'm sure they are extremely frustrated that the PLA has pretty much destroyed their 10, 15-year plans that they had for the Indian market, which have all gone up in smoke in the year 2020. Now, I think if you look at young people, many of them look at China as an opportunity. I think older people carry more baggage, I think. They tend to look at India in many ways, especially the more nationalistic people that you might encounter, look at India as part of this part of the crowd, America-led crowd that wants to keep China down. So I think, frankly, there's a myriad views, a spectrum of views that change depending on who you ask, where they work, and their age. And I'd say all of these play a role. Broadly speaking, I would say that, frankly, the one obvious point is that there is a mismatch in terms of attention. And I think it's natural that we pay more attention to the Chinese and they pay to us only by virtue of the fact that I think over the last few years, whether it's their academia, whether it's their media, their abiding obsession is America. I think the US is the touchstone for everything that they do. And even they're reporting India figures much less than China figures in our reporting. And I think that's generally, if you look at public attention, I would say that India figures lower down the list than America. And I would say it probably occupies, I'm generalizing here, but it probably occupies the same amount of attention as, say, Europe or Japan, which is not to say it's insignificant, but I would say it's number two after the US. I'd say these are big relationships that they pay attention to: India, Japan, Europe, then South Korea. So I'd say that's where we figure in their imagination. And I think the US occupies 80% of all of their mental energies, whether it's the media or scholars. And some of the older generation of scholars who General Banerjee, like Marjali and others, often tell me that they're finding it hard to get a new generation of India experts because all of the young experts want to go to the West and live in the West and become US experts and Europe experts. That's what gets them attention and fame in China, not being an India expert. So actually, he felt that there was a richer sort of roster of people who grew up in the 50s and 60s who were studying India. And they were encouraged to study India in the early days. But now they feel that actually there's a withering away of their talent when it comes to understanding India as well, which is something that concerns them. Which I thought was quite interesting.
Very true. If I could just say a word here, when I first went to China in 1991, June, in all my travels, Beijing interaction at the highest level, political level, military chiefs and things like that, Chengdu military region, Wuhan, and other places interacting with all the other military officers, etc. I thought that nobody in China had heard of the 1962 conflict. This was just absent in their thinking. So as you quite rightly said, their target and goal and their barometer for comparison is entirely with the USA. And hence, the expertise on China, very few people are studying about India in China today. There's just half a dozen people at most, and just one to each in some of the major think tanks, not in any other. So there is a gap in this understanding of China, or in China of India. And till recently, we had also very little understanding of China amongst our scholars and others. But now let's come to further this thing, is to look at very briefly the border question. The border question written about this in your book, but I don't want to go into the details of it. I don't go into the politics of the border question. In any case, that's an issue that has to be dealt with separately. But the questions that arise is that why is this reluctant to resolve the border question? A number of confidence building measures have been proposed, accepted, but held up, not implemented. And at the same time, over the decades, since 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi met Deng Xiaoping, we've been trying to resolve the border question, but with no success. Now, why is it? What are the reasons behind it? At one level, of course, one can say that the Chinese leadership do not necessarily want the border to be resolved, but they want relations to be improved. And so, therefore, Deng Xiaoping's policy then was that let us improve our relations, bilateral relations across the board in every other way, but the border can be left to the next generation to resolve because it's too difficult to handle now. Whereas our view has been that no, let us resolve the border question, let us get this issue out of the way, and then we can, of course, address other substantive means of cooperation among our two countries. Until we resolve this particular issue, this particular dilemma regarding what comes first and what comes next, we are not even addressing the border question seriously. And hence we have this prolonged at the border, at the military level, the foreign service present, etc., but not getting anywhere. Do you see the possibility of any breakthrough among this? The question also builds up to trust. For example, whenever we have a few weeks meeting at the military level, we come to some sort of an understanding regarding withdrawal of forces, adjusting the troop deployment in the border areas. Chinese perhaps agree to it, but immediately after that, they go back on those words. And so nothing actually happens on the ground. So is there a possibility of this trust building between India and China when India can expect that China will implement the agreements that we have signed amongst ourselves or build on measures that can address the border question?
I think you put it perfectly, and I think what you just described is a paradox that we can't get out of, which is why I'm quite pessimistic ultimately, because of the fact that, as you just rightly said, they seem to look at the boundary resolution as Jiang Jiadong of Fudan University put it really well, who I quote in my book. He said that the Chinese look at boundary resolution as a consequence of improved relations, but the Indian side look at the boundary resolution as a prerequisite to improve relations, which is a fundamental paradox. And I think that there's no getting out of that paradox. I think that one interesting thing that has come out in recent Chinese writings in 2020 is this argument that, and I think this is a fair characterization of the Chinese view, which is they look at the boundary as leverage. And I think that for whatever reason, they seem to that by agreeing to the boundary resolution, they are giving away something for nothing. And the point that some of the scholars have made, and I think it's no coincidence that multiple people have made the same argument in 2020, is that they say that, say, if India says they want better relations and we resolve the boundary, nothing that the Chinese can do can hold India to it, and India could settle the boundary and still carry on with, closer maritime cooperation, for example, with the Quad. So they feel that China is giving away something for nothing. I think it's ingrained logic, and I think because of this logic of seeing the boundary as leverage, I'm deeply pessimistic of the situation improving. Just to also add one point from what you said in your last answer about them not having the intellectual resources to look at India and understand India, I think you're completely right. I think we often look at our own deficiencies in understanding China, as we should. But at the same time, it does apply both ways. And I think fundamentally, they do not understand or in denial about the fact that, for example, how the memory of 62, for instance, and the legacy of this whole trust issue is so important today and continues today. But they seem completely oblivious of the fact that we have this memory of the war, which they keep asking us, why do people in the media keep reporting on it? Because the fact of the matter is, for all of us, even those of us like me growing up in the early 80s, China is synonymous with what happened in 62. And China is synonymous with what happened in Tibet. And it's part of our psychological understanding of China. And they completely have, I don't think they cognize that at all. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. But I think so. I completely agree with you on that point that I think there's a complete mismatch in terms of how we are approaching it and how they are approaching it, both the boundary and the broader sort of perception as well.
You have dealt with the border question and had talks with the Chinese generals and others. What do you feel about this?
No, I think the answer is the boundary question is, of course, a major contention between India and China. We have our India-China relations set of contradictions: cooperation, coordination, competition, conflict. So, and I agree with you totally. If we don't understand China fully, they don't understand it at all. And that is, I think, where the next question comes into. Before we go to the questions from the participants, there are one too many out there. I would like to understand from you, what is the strategic intent of China and its aggressive behavior, its arrogance, not only along the LAC, but all over, like I said, South China Sea and others. And I refuse to believe it is the infrastructure development on the Indian side. I refuse to believe the strategic intent was on the DBO Shiok road, which that was 19 years in the making. So I don't feel that was a strategic intent. And like you rightly said, that of late, especially 2013 onwards, everything emanates from Beijing and from Xi Jinping. So what do you, in your feel, what is the strategic intent of China's aggressive behavior and arrogance? Because it comes at a very wrong time. When the relations were improving, we had the Wuhan spirit and Mahabalipuram and everything. And suddenly you find everything has changed. Though in a paper which I wrote in 2017, I had said such a thing is likely to happen. But the fact remains, we still haven't been able to discern properly the strategic intent.
Ananth, would you like to respond?
No, absolutely. I'll be very honest here. I think a lot of analysts have written late that they expected this to happen and it was always going to happen. And so I think they've been quite critical of how the government's handled it. But to be very honest, from my own perspective, I was deeply surprised at what happened this summer, and I did not expect this to happen at all. I'll be honest with you up front, because as I write in the book, I cover the Doklam crisis from Beijing, and I felt that it was as low as things would go. And frankly, I think both governments invested a lot in 2018 and 2019 to bring things back from the brink. And I think that even though we are critical of all the boundary mechanisms now, that they generally worked fairly well since 1993. And I think that also 2018 and 2019 were among the most peaceful years in the boundary in the last 10 years or so. And that's a fact in terms of our own records that we have. So for me, I was deeply puzzled at what prompted all of this. I completely agree with you that I don't think it had anything to do either with India's infrastructure, DSCBO road. I don't think it had anything to do with the Ladakh reorganization or Article 370, which a lot of people have argued, only because from my own perspective, it seemed to be an issue they were upset about. But he went on with his visit to Chennai after that. He didn't bring it up at all in his visit to Chennai. And I think that and my actual reading is, I think Chinese analysts picked up on this after Indian analysts had written about China reacting to the abrogation of Article 370. At least that's my perspective. I think it's not a popular perspective, but I think that's my view, that I don't think that was a reason. I think more broadly, it seems to be, if you look at what's happening with Taiwan as well, in the past, I would agree with analysts who would say that all the theaters are different, that the actions in the South China Sea are driven by what they want to do in the South China Sea. The actions in the East China Sea are driven by that. The action in India is completely different. I would have broadly agreed with that. But to me, it seems that in all of these theaters that to some degree, they've decided that in early 2020, whether it's internal insecurities because of the pandemic and the questions the leadership was facing early on, which we've forgotten about now, but they were very under fire in Jan and Feb. And history tells us that at moments of internal insecurity, the whole system goes into this mode of going to the other extreme. And for whatever reason, they have moved to be much more aggressive on the boundary than they were in the past. That's borne out in how they I'm not getting into details here, but it's very clear that the way they've been conducting exercises, for example, is very different in 2020 than it was in the past, both in Tibet, Xinjiang, and I think elsewhere as well. So that, frankly, my honest answer to you is I genuinely don't know what prompted them to do what they did. They've never given a reasonable explanation for what prompted what happened this summer. So the best guess you could have is they saw a moment of opportunity and went for it. And I think that the logical answer is they have taken a decision that they did not think that the relationship with India was worth preserving, and that they were clearly aware of the fallback. And perhaps one argument that's come out in the Chinese press is that they felt that the direction of India-US relations was already going in one particular direction. So they felt that regardless of what they were going to do on the boundary, we were headed to a period of confrontation. But what changed after October 2019 and April 2020, I genuinely do not know, but it does seem to be, as General Bhatia said, something that they've taken at a higher level, that they were prepared for this downturn in relations, and they've taken a call that regardless of the consequence, they would go ahead with it, which is certainly something worrying.
Yes, well, let me just briefly mention on this. As you know, after the Doklam, this is a recent development. I think it's a post-Doklam. We had a high-level meeting at Chengdu in China between two delegations, China and India. Chinese delegation was led by Dai Bingguo, the senior-most foreign service officer, now this thing, and outside by Sham Saran. There were 5 senior generals from China, and I was the only general from India, but of course, other high-level experts. That Doklam incident really, I think, was a watershed in our military relations, and this is really a fallout of that. The discussions that I had, there were 2 very good friends of mine in the Chinese, who were Chinese generals. We had twice with them on the CCTV program and had numerous discussions with them during that time, over 5 days, and it was quite apparent. And this time, when they came for this preparation, they had come very well prepared, as you know. Now, well prepared for carrying out their summer exercises in the Tibetan plateau. But in the guise of those exercises, they had built up their forces and had prepared for a conflict on the border with India. The perceptions are different. These are at the larger international geostrategic level. We have no time to discuss that. But let's come to the last question before we open up for questions and a broader discussion. So, after the Galwan incident, is it the end of a chapter? And do we now consider that China and India will not be able to resolve the issues through peaceful means, through dialogue and discussion, and hence a state of perpetual conflict is what will characterize our relations, not just on the border, but in overall context between India and China. And so, therefore, are we entering into a new phase in global geopolitical confrontation, where India and China will be on different to deal with each other from a different perspective? Very briefly, can you respond to that? And after that, may I request Vinod to throw open for questions from the audience and for a discussion. Over to Ananth.
I would completely agree with you that it's a new chapter. I think it is a new chapter, frankly. But I sincerely hope that that doesn't mean that it's going to be a new chapter of perpetual conflict or an active line of actual control. And I hope that I hope that the Chinese will at least see sense. And I don't know, maybe that's a hope. But I do completely agree that it's a new chapter, and I find it very difficult to imagine us going back to the model that was in place from 1988 to 2020, which was predicated on the idea that the boundary is a problem, but it shouldn't come in the way of other areas of cooperation, that you could have trade ties, investment ties, you could cooperate multilaterally. I think some aspects of that will continue, like, for example, our multilateral cooperation with China on various forums. But I genuinely think that I think the boundary is front and center now, and I find it very difficult to imagine that changing. And I think you're already seeing that reflected in policy. For example, the way that the government of India has now reassessed its trade and investment relations with China, which marked a big U-turn from 2014 onwards, when there was an understanding that getting more investment from China could be a factor of stability in the relationship. And I think that was a good argument. But I think that frankly, even the Chinese companies didn't expect what happened in 2020. So I think that I find it very difficult to imagine us going back to that old model. I don't know what the new model is going to be, but it does seem to me that it can't be the kind of business as usual anymore. And I don't think we're going to carry on with economic trade, investment ties in a very deep way when the situation is going to continue on the boundary as it has been over the last few months.
Thank you very much. I agree with you totally. 650 million.
In all our discussions in this India-China relations, we tend to forget and tend to neglect a brief period when Mao smiled at Rajesh Mishra. It was in June of 1970. Sorry, 1st October, I think, 1970, when Rajesh Mishra was the Charge d'Affaires in Beijing. And at the end of the parade, Mao came and shook his hands and said, "How can we go on like this? Let us be friends again." It was one way of Mao, I feel, more or less accepting responsibility for the worsening of relations between India and China and wanting to make up. And after that, of course, efforts were made, but the Bangladesh war intervened and there were difficult situations. Congress party in Delhi was in a difficult position, and so nothing much could happen at that time. But I think there are possibilities if you look at issues much more objectively to build relations and to safeguard each other's interests and still move forward. Okay, Vinod, please go forward. Open the house for discussions.
Thank you, sir. I think we had a very interesting session till now, and I fully agree. When India went wrong in not being able to discern China's strategic intent, I think China went very wrong in not being able to assess India's resolute response, and especially Galwan. Because Galwan will haunt China for a long time as India-China relations are concerned. We have memories which go back to 62, And now the youth, which is about 650 million in India, is going to remember Gulwan for a long time. Very tactical action, but it will impact India China relation a very long time. I think I fully agree with that. We have some questions from the participants and some are very interesting. Some of have been covered in some way. Dr. Venkateswaran, he's asked, why has China become so visibly assertive now with wolf border diplomacy, a border standoff with India, etc.? What are the triggers and how far is China willing to go? It's a very interesting question. I'll just take two to three questions at a time, and then because of time. Next, we have a question from Samit Reddy, and it says, "Sir, given the suppression of dissent within the CCP under China Xi, how do you think he'll be able to maintain his hold power while relying on unreliable information? Also, do you think China can continue to rise given the increased dictatorial tendencies under Xi?" I'll leave you two questions. These are unrelated questions. So the first one is from Dr. Venkateswaran, second from Mr. Reddy.
I think I think the question of unreliable information is a great point. For me, Hong Kong comes to mind because so I was in Hong Kong from the last 4 months of 2019, which coincided with the protests. And the interesting thing was that a lot of people felt that they did not see it coming, which is really interesting, that they did not see the protest movement coming, because he had underlings at the liaison office who were sending up reports basically saying that there's a tiny minority of people who are doing all of this, and the majority of Hong Kongers are in favor of the CPC, which was, and by all accounts and purposes, they believed that until October, and then they had this rude shock, which led them to push this national security law. So I think this point of reliable information is a great point. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's coming out in reporting by various people that it really is a problem. I think the other question in terms of why they are acting out, frankly, I'm always careful in giving and trying to give answers with certainty about these things which we may never know with certainty. I think so much has been written about why they have done what they have done on the LAC, or even why they're doing what they're doing with Taiwan as we speak, whether it's internal related, whether it's COVID related. To be very honest with you, I don't know. And I always believe that, as wiser people have said, I think it's more useful to focus on what they're doing rather than why they're doing it, as we may never know with certainty why they're doing it. But I think that it is clear that I think over the next 2 years, at least in terms of dissent, since they're looking at two big anniversaries, July 2021, which is going to be the 100-year anniversary of the CPC, and then October 2022, which is going to be the next big national congress of the CPC and Xi Jinping's 10 years in charge. I think over the next 2 years, they probably, I would think they will continue in this vein, would be my hunch. And I think that the other big X factor is what happens in the US in November and Jan. And I've heard some Chinese analysts say in the media that they felt that if relations with US were to really worsen, that they would be genuinely concerned about relations with India as well, and they would try and fix that. But perhaps they'll be waiting and watching to see what happens with the US, as we all are.
I'll go over the questions again, some of the questions. We are running out of time, and we'd like to cover all aspects. There's a question from Kamlesh Agnihotri, who is Captain Kamlesh Agnihotri, who is a senior secretary at St. George. Is Xi's China dream linked with BRI-CPC? In that sense, does he feel that the world? I have lost the question. Just a minute, please. Yeah, I say that again. Is Xi's dream linked to BRI-CPC in the sense that does he feel that the world should also follow cooperative behavior to further it?
Sure.
And there's a question from Dr. Ashok Dhar. He said, due to legacy issues, as rightly mentioned by Dr. Ghani, we know little of each other, and hence there's a trust deficit. Difficult to bridge in the short term. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that, of course, in the book, I do have an entire chapter. I have one chapter on BRI, and I have one chapter on CPEC and the China-Pakistan relationship. And they're both really, I think, closely interlinked to the China dream, and only because I think the Belt and Road is so interesting as I think it really marked a huge change in China's approach to the world and China's diplomacy. I think it was their way for the first time of really trying to stake a claim to global leadership. And I think whether or not it succeeds or fails, I think sometimes people miss the point by trying to do a financial accounting of it, that it left this amount of debt in one country, this amount of debt in another country. I think if you look broadly, I think its success is in offering an idea and a vision of how China looks at its place in the world. And I think in that sense, they have been moderately successful in some ways, especially if you look at our own neighborhood and the countries that have signed on. And I would agree with you, I would agree with the question that they're closely interlinked. But I don't think they're set in stone. And I think that they've also, I think there's writings coming out of China at the moment that suggest that because of the financial challenges and problems that they're dealing with on account of the pandemic, they're reevaluating many projects, and they may end up spending a lot less on many projects, including in Pakistan. It's going to be much, much less than what they advertised initially. Now, on the second question, fully agree about trust deficit, and I think, frankly, I don't trust is ever going to be there in this relationship. I find it quite interesting sometimes in the media that the question that often comes up in TV debates is, can we trust China? I don't think that's a question to ask at all, because I think it's a self-evident question. It can be answered easily. I don't think it's ever going to be an issue of trust. History has told us that, and frankly, it means we aren't learning from history. So I think that it's always going to be a relationship with this mix of, with this balance of finding some way in which we can coexist. I think it's a very limited goal that we have. I don't think it's ever going to be a relationship of partners. I think it's just going to be an attempt by both to find a way to live with each other and hopefully minimize the conflict as much as we can.
There's a question on the economic front. It's an important one. We all know that China's GDP for 5 times ours, and the per capita income of India is $2,400, whereas China's about $14,000, and it continues to widen the gap. The question from Mr. Reddy is,
yeah, I see it. I think on the GDP
widening gap. Correct, absolutely right. And you have the increasing presence of okay, that's the next one. There's also a question on the increasing presence of media houses and the booming social media platform in China, which has to some extent eroded the very essence of censorship in China. I think you had covered this earlier on.
Yeah, no, I'll come to that question first, which I briefly touched upon, but it's a great point that I think it has changed the way that information is processed in China. I think that it's quite interesting that the party no longer has a monopoly on information. It's not that people are getting information on India from People's Daily or the Global Times, which we all pay attention to. No one in China reads Global Times English, and not many people read Global Times Chinese as well. I think they get more information from WeChat and Weibo than they do. I think it's good and bad. In some ways, it's good because, for example, in the last few months, a couple of articles that people have sent me on WeChat that have gone viral have taken a very different tack in understanding India from what you see in the official media. Some are written by people who live in India and try to be more understanding of how India works. In that sense, I think it's bringing new perspectives that aren't mediated by party censorship. The bad part of it is, just as we have with WhatsApp, there's a lot of rubbish information that's being circulated, conspiracy theories about India, about the boundary issue as well. And the party censors are happy to let bad information be spread when it makes India in a bad light. So that's the bad part of it. I think that even during this summer's events, if you looked at some of the images and videos that were being shared on Weibo, there's a lot of false information, fake information being shared by Chinese social media on the boundary as well. But they were not censoring it because they were happy to let that go. I completely agree on the differential. I think that's the heart of it. And as long as that continues, obviously there has to be ultimately a lot of what we discuss on foreign policy in these relationships come down to what we do at home, and everything else follows from that. And I do mention in the book a little bit as well that the more this differential grows, the more aggressive. Sometimes you hear the rhetoric from Chinese analysts and officials as well, who feel that in their view, one of the dilemmas in this relationship is that they feel that the Indian side is not cognizant enough of this power differential. And obviously, we deal with the Chinese as equals, but I think they resent that notion of being equated. And in many ways, I think it's a sentiment that's been there for quite a long time, and I think that's a sentiment that still exists on their part.
There's one last question from Soman Ghosh. What happens to the Chinese assumption of territories in the name of business with various countries?
What happens to the Chinese? I'm sure I completely understand that question. I don't know if it's General Bhatia, I don't know if you could shed light on it. Does it mean, yeah?
Yeah, basically, I think it is what India has done. If China is aggressive in India, we have tried to do less and less business with China. Though I do feel that that is not really happening in many fields. We are still doing business with China. And we can't have a China policy anti-China. We have to have a policy which is pro India. So we still want to do business with China in many fields actually. Though it is reduced, but it is again picking up. We have to do business with them. So I think the question pertains to other countries. Would you like to amplify?
No, I completely would. I would agree with your assessment that I think it's going to be a mixed picture, whether it's India or any other country. I think the fact is that China is at the center of global supply chains, whether you like it or not. And I don't think that Indian policy should be shooting ourselves in the foot. If you're going to be paying a huge amount more to get goods from somewhere else, I think the problem for us is we need to have our strategy focus on India, as you said, and build self-reliance in areas where we are reliant on China. The most obvious example is our pharmaceutical industry, for example, where we are reliant on imports from China. I think it's about us having a strategy where you minimize your vulnerability, but at the same time, it should be driven by our interest, not about proving a point. I think that the action, for example, on banning apps, it made sense in the sense that you aren't hurting India's interest in any way. It's a safe decision to take. But I think that no one in the government of India is going to be under any illusion that that's going to change the PLA's stance on the boundary. It doesn't work that way. And I think it hasn't changed the PLA's stance on the boundary. So I think there are sometimes different compartments, but I would completely agree with General Bhatia where it should be driven more by our interests, our needs, rather than trying to prove a point. I don't think that's going to get you very far. I think, yeah, if that answers the question.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time. I would request General Banerjee to give the concluding remarks, and after that, I'll take a minute and thank everyone. Over to General Banerjee.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Vinod. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and thanks to Ananth for giving an on-the-spot current analysis of the development. We are really at a critical spot in our relations with China. As I mentioned, I think things have changed. China today is not what it was even 10 years ago before the Xi Jinping era. But Chinese are also different. Within China, there are whole new issues that have risen. The Chinese are thinking in a different way. They are very much more globalized than what they were, say, even 20 years ago. And hence, they are a force to reckon with within the domestic developments within China, which we have to watch very, very carefully. But at the same time, I think it is the end of a chapter in India-China relations. From now onwards, they're going to be much more sharp, much more careful in our analysis of the China's policies, China's challenge to India, and those are the issues that Ananth has highlighted in this book. And we have to build not only a coalition among nations of the world, but also prepare ourselves comprehensively to develop our own comprehensive national power, as well as develop a capability to defend our borders in a much more effective and credit-worthy manner. That's a challenge that confronts us today, now for the next several years at least. And thank you, Vinod, for this wonderful opportunity and for organizing this very interesting discussion.
Well, it remains for me to thank our two guests for the day, the author, Mr. Ananth Krishnan. Thank you so much. It's an education just listening to you. Your on-ground experience is really unmatched. And I've read the book. I will study the book. For all the participants out here, thank you very much. And if you really want to start understanding China from Indian perspective, please read the book. It is worth every word that is written in it. And now, it is really, really, really worth it. And I will not say anything more than that. Yes, sir.
It costs less than 500 rupees. And if you give Vinod can, St. George can send the email address of the seller here, and you just order it. Within 2 days in Delhi, it will be available with you.
It comes the next day, and I think it's worth every word that's written in it. It is. I consider myself, I'm not a China man. I'm a China fan. I what they do. I look at it very closely. Having been now 40 years and as a DGMO also. But one thing I would like to just part before I say thank you is I think we need to thank China for what it did. It achieved strategic surprise, and fortunately for us, it did not push the momentum through. Somewhere it had a limited aim along the LAC, and despite the strategic surprise, it let go of the momentum, giving us time to recoup, to rebuild, to reassess, and to redeploy. So that is something which really got to thank China. We were taken by strategic surprises, no doubt about it, at the strategic level, operational level, even at the tactical level. Let me say that. And that time which has come in very handy for the last, since May. If we do not now wake up, I was commissioned 1971 after 71 war, and every time China was a long-term threat. I commanded a company, I commanded four. There are others who have been corps commander, division commanders, brigade, and tank commander along the China. It was always said China is a long-term threat. I never believed that actually. China was always a threat, but we were always so comfortable looking at the Western adversary that we forgot China as a threat. And thank God now it has manifested itself and it has given us time to rethink our strategies, to rethink our priorities, and that is something which I feel we got to thank China for giving us that time. Having said that, I think today's discussion is very interesting. Thank you so much, Ananth Krishnan, for sparing your time. I know how busy you are, but thank you so much indeed. It's been once again educational. Thank you, General Banerjee. Thank you, sir, for facilitating this and for facilitating this. We go back more educated and we. I also want to thank all the participants, each one of them. It's not possible for the name everyone, but let me just say thank you to each one of you who's been here. Very encouraging. The questions are very well said. I would, however, as a director of St. George, I would like to thank Admiral Shekhar Sinha and General Rajeshwar, both former CIS and former chairman of St. George, and on the advisory board of St. George. I would also like to thank General Venki Patil Jayanandar, very senior veterans who always mentored us. Thank you very much. And all my colleagues who've been there, thank you so much indeed. On behalf of Center of George War Studies, big thank you to each one of you, and a special thanks to Mr. Ananth Krishnan and General Banerjee. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, before you sign off, my thanks to General Ravi Arora for lending us the platform and for Brigadier it's his platform and he's organized the whole thing, and to Brigadier Bhutani for the conduct part of it. Thank you very much. Sorry, I am getting old now.
Thank you, Bhatia sir. Really enjoyed.
Thank you so much, General Kumar. Thank you so much.